Good evening, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you all for being here. I'm Michael Genovese, the director of the Institute for Leadership Studies, and we are sponsoring these 4 events surrounding the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This is the first in the series. Topic, of course, is Women and the Declaration. This coming Monday will be the second, and that will be Slavery and the Declaration. We have another panel discussion. Then on the 12th, I will be talking about the Declaration itself. I'll dissect it and talk about its components. And then on the 25th, the last session we have, will be with Professor Jessica Levinson of the Loyola Law School, and she'll talk about the Declaration, the rule of law, and the limits of democracy. As you see from the topics, we are not hiding from the more controversial areas, and we're not hesitant to confront them. That's what a university does. We look hard, and we look long, and we look deeply, and even the blemishes, even the sins become important for us to understand who we are. And so please be aware that some of the things that some people say might be controversial, that's fine. And this is a topic that has sparked a number of critics to lash out against people who look at the Constitution and look at the Declaration by analyzing it through the lens of slavery or the lens of women in voting. This panel is a terrific panel. When I thought about who to put together, the first person I thought is Professor Stella O, who is going to be the panel moderator. We will have questions and answers, and so we have a few students who will hand out cards. If you have a question, you can write it down and then pass it to the side, and then we'll hand it to the panel for a discussion afterwards. So you don't want to hear me, you want to hear the panel, so please, Professor Stella O.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for your remarks, and actually for organizing this wonderful series of events commemorating the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's so nice to see you all here. I know it's a Wednesday afternoon, right? And instead of being out in the sun, you're here, so thank you, especially the students. So as we gather to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we are not simply commemorating a founding document, but are critically reflecting upon an unfinished project. The Declaration of Independence famously proclaimed that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights, grounding political legitimacy in the ideas of liberty and equality. Yet the assertion that these truths are self-evident invites a critical question: self-evident to whom? In practice, the universality of this claim rests on profound exclusions. Women were denied legal and political personhood. The poor were largely excluded from meaningful participation, and people of color, especially enslaved Africans and indigenous people, were violently denied access to liberties. This tension between lofty ideas espoused by the Declaration and lived exclusions is not just a historical footnote. Rather, it's a central paradox that continues to shape our struggles for freedom today. For women, legal personhood, property rights, political participation, and bodily autonomy remain largely inaccessible. 15 years after the signing of the Declaration, Marie Olympigouz issued the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, a radical feminist countertext that exposed the gendered limits and selective applicability of these universal rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen did not merely ask for women to be included. It revealed that freedom itself was incoherent when built upon the exclusion of half the population. As we reflect on this anniversary, the task before us isn't to sanctify and only celebrate the Declaration, but to activate it, animate it, to ask what truths about equality, bodily autonomy, care, and collective survival we can make evident through action now. The legacy of women revolutionaries that our panelists will discuss remind us that liberty is not bestowed by documents alone. It is continually made, contested, and expanded. Current legislative battles surrounding bodily autonomy, access to healthcare, education, underscore a broader and urgent question. Are women's rights truly protected as fundamental, unalienable human rights? Or do they remain contingent privileges, vulnerable to political shifts and ideologies? Recent legal developments following the Supreme Court decision of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization undermines bodily autonomy and health outcomes that affect women's ability to complete education, participate fully in the workforce, and control their life trajectories. This disproportionately impacts women experiencing economic insecurity, women of color, immigrants, queer women, and other marginalized groups. While these struggles are often framed as localized policy disputes, there are mirror patterns unfolding across the globe. In 2025, the United Nations issued a report warning that women's rights are under sustained attack worldwide, citing increased gender-based violence and barriers to education intensified by conflict, economic instability, and climate crises. Despite these challenges, the arc of women's activism suggests resilience and renewal. Grassroots movements, legislative politics, and continued advocacy in education and labor equity indicate a multi-pronged struggle. As feminist theorist Judith Butler notes, rights are not merely gifts from institutions, but are lived practices that must continually be enacted through collective action and solidarity. Such perspectives reframe setbacks not as endpoints, but as calls to expand and deepen our democratic commitment. So with this, I'll proceed with introducing our speakers for today, and afterwards open up the panel to questions from the audience that will be passing on index cards. It's an honor to chair this panel of distinguished scholars and colleagues. Professor Sina Kramer is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. She is author of Excluded Within: The Unintelligibility of Radical Political Actors. Her research focuses on political epistemology and constitutive exclusion and the construction of political agency through gender, race, and sexuality. And she approaches these questions through both philosophical texts and political struggles. Professor Carla Bittel is Professor of History. Her research focuses on gender, health, and material cultures of science and the politics of knowledge. She is the author of Mary Putnam Jacoby and the Politics of Medicine in 19th Century America, and working with paper, Gender Practices in the History of Knowledge. Professor Bittel's research has been supported by several grants and fellowships, including the NSF Scholars Award and the Dibner Research Fellowship in the History of Science and Technology from the Huntington Library. Professor Feryal Charif is Associate Professor of Political Science. She is the author of Myths About Women's Rights, How, Where, and Why Rights Advance. Her research focuses on international relations and politics in the Middle East, with an emphasis on gender and human rights. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Politics and International Studies Quarterly, among others, and her report on peacekeeping was published by the United Nations. So I'm going to turn it over now to the panelists. Thank you. Yes.
Many thanks to Dr. O, and thanks for the invitation to speak on the panel commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. My grandmother knew how to make a meal out of anything. She was an Irish Catholic farm wife with a high school education, raising 9 children, and worked as a lunch lady at the local high school. She was skilled in canning and pickling and stretching scraps to feed a family. She had to work hard to live on the dairy farm in Minnesota where my mother was raised and where I lived for a bit. too as a young child. I often think of this skill required to make not only something, but 3 good meals a day to feed 11 people around her great long table out of disparate pieces, drawing on a long knowledge of recipes, knowing what works and what doesn't, what fits and what won't, and a faith in your vision of the result, even when it's a little challenging to see at the outset. This skill, this specific genius, reminds me of what queer theorist Jose Munoz calls disidentification. Munoz uses this concept to describe how queer people, women, and people of color, and people who are some or all of these, use the texts and ideas available to them to make sense of their lives, even when they themselves do not fit into them, or when they fit only awkwardly. You have to use what you've got. And so you use texts, histories, ideas that were not meant for you, and in many cases explicitly exclude you. You use them in ways that their authors would never have anticipated, let alone endorsed. And you use the ingredients available to you with faith in your vision of freedom. I see the long history of the reception of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence as a good example of this. Women and queer people and people of color have throughout the ages learned to use what is near to hand, to draw on existing resources that were never meant for them, to articulate a vision of freedom that pushes us beyond the limitations of the ingredients available. And so I want to argue in my remarks today that the meaning of women and the Declaration of Independence 250 years later is that the Declaration of Independence calls upon us to take up the meaning of freedom for ourselves. As a feminist theorist and a philosopher by training, my approach to the Declaration is a reflection on its conceptual effects and the transmission of those concepts over time. I focus on the tension in the Declaration between the aspiration of its ideas and the exclusions. We are familiar with the document's exclusions. While the term men was sometimes taken as a universal, a term used to refer to humans generally, the term has never truly been universal. Sometimes we can see ourselves in the Declaration, sometimes we can see ourselves in the founding documents of the United States, and sometimes we cannot. For instance, as the judges dissenting in the 2022 Supreme Court case, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, write, commenting upon the method of originalism or textualism the majority used to arrive at their judgment as to whether the right to an abortion is guaranteed under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, quote, as an initial matter, note a mistake in the preceding sentence. We referred there to the people who ratified the 14th Amendment. What rights did those people have in their heads at the time? But of course, people did not ratify the 14th Amendment, men did, unquote. That women were not a part of the people who ratified the 14th Amendment is relevant to our method of reading the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Nevertheless, the Declaration calls us all to interpret the meaning of freedom for our own people in our own context anew each time. So while women are excluded from the Declaration broadly, as are presumably the, quote, merciless Indian savages that are described in the long train of abuses in the document, to say nothing of those enslaved at the time the Declaration was signed, the ideas expressed by the Declaration itself have a life far beyond the limitations of those who drafted, signed, and defended it by putting their very lives at stake. This is evidenced by the reception of the Declaration as a revolutionary moment in not only US history, but the history of the West, sort of broadly. The American Revolution was an inspiration, for instance, to the French Revolution, which began in 1789 with the meeting of the National Constituent Assembly. The document following, this document here, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, was the guiding document of the new French Republic, laying down a kind of Bill of Rights for a brand new subject in the new Republic of France, the French citizen. But again, that document's ideas, as inspirational as they were, embedded its own exclusions. As my colleague just mentioned, in response, Maria Lampe de Gouges, a writer, salon host, and an abolitionist and a revolutionary feminist, wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen and offered it to the National Assembly shortly after the Assembly adopted a new constitution in 1791. This document claimed women as belonging to the category of citizen for the first time in France. De Gouges stuck to Enlightenment principles in her declaration, but offered a new interpretation of them. Where many of the Enlightenment inspirations for the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen had set out an interpretation of nature that offered a basis for natural hierarchies, whether racial or gendered, de Gouges instead argued that reading the record of nature offered instead a basis for equality rooted in the harmonious cooperation of its masculine and feminine elements. As all of the students of my feminist theories class will well know. She writes, quote, "Go back to the animals, consult the elements, study plants, finally, glance at all the modifications of organic matter, and surrender to the evidence when I offer you the means. Search, probe, and distinguish, if you can, the sexes in the administration of nature. Everywhere you will find them mingled. Everywhere they cooperate in harmonious togetherness in this immortal masterpiece. Man alone has raised exceptional circumstances to a principle." Despite the equality she claimed on the basis of the record of nature, she articulated rights specific to women's difference from men, given their role in human life. The right, for instance, she claims, for women to name the fathers of their children and to receive their support in raising them, no matter their station. Her account combined sexuate difference with the equality of civil and political rights. Her argument, cogent as it was not well received, to put it mildly. Her declaration was not adopted, she was not received by the National Assembly, and just 2 years later, she was beheaded. But the ideas she expressed, ideas inspired by those of the Declaration of Independence, live on, and they instructed those to come after. They offer a vision of freedom that we can use to shape our own. I turn to one more document as evidence of the life of the ideas of the Declaration of Independence beyond their articulation, and by the exclusions that mark that articulation. This is the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party. Because of the exclusion of Black people from the Declaration, the drafters could hardly have foreseen the use to which it would be put in the revolutionary program of an organization devoted to Black liberation, drafted first in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. The 10-point program argued, amongst other things, for full employment, decent housing, free health care, and end to police brutality for Black people. The 10th point in the program ends in a summative note and then continues. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume amongst the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect of the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yes, they reproduce the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. The 10-point program of the Black Panther Party would not seem at first blush to be a document concerned, first of all, with the rights of women. But despite the fact that many of the members of the Black Panther Party held women in low regard, again, the ideas of the document push beyond the meaning that the framers of that document might have held. For instance, the insistence on universal free health care and on decent, affordable housing, positions that are absolutely necessary to the crucial work of social reproduction, the work of caring for children and elders, the work of life itself, to which women are so often assigned. The demand that the government provision these essential resources to Black people is an absolutely revolutionary demand that, were it to be met, would support the liberation not only of Black people in the United States, but women beyond Black women. This interpretation of the ideals of the Declaration carry it far beyond the exclusions embedded in that document and articulate a new vision of freedom. And this is where I want to turn in my last moment in the exploration of the tension in the Declaration between the life of its ideals and its exclusions, and the exclusions embedded in the document itself. And here I turn to the police murder of Renee Good in the streets of Minneapolis. Renee Good was a 37-year-old white woman, a Christian, a mother of 3, and a lesbian. She and her wife, Becca Good, encountered an ICE operation on Portland Avenue in Minneapolis after dropping off their son at school. Becca got out of their truck to record the ICE officers. Good was told to leave the scene and was ordered to exit the vehicle. Renee followed one of these orders, waving one vehicle past her before she turned to exit down Portland. One officer, later identified as Jonathan Ross, stepped in front of the driver's side bumper and fired 3 shots into the truck, killing her. She was shot in the arm, chest, and head, and as he walked away from the scene, Ross referred to her as a fucking bitch. The Declaration of Independence, despite the tension between the aspirations of its ideals and the exclusions baked into it, calls on its inheritors as a free people to determine the meaning of their own freedom. This is a contentious and difficult task, it is true. Nothing guarantees its success. It belongs to each of its inheritors to do the work to make it true. This is as true of Marie Olympe Gouges as it was of Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. It was as true of them as it was of Renee Good. Good was killed defending the freedom of the people closest to her, the freedom of the people in its most intimate sense, beyond the confines of the family to which so many women are consigned, the freedom of her neighbors in the city, in this case, the city of Minneapolis. Feminist political theorist Iris Marion Young defines the ideal of the city as the place where people can be different without exclusion. It is in the city where we find the democratic ideal most instantiated. Here we find difference without exclusion, a being together of strangers. These strangers are linked together as neighbors, not necessarily or primarily as citizens, and under current conditions must be defended as neighbors. Good died defending that ideal, and the federal government lied on her name, calling her a domestic terrorist, deserving of her murder. In our current moment, neighbors defending neighbors are linked in the imagination of federal officials, from Kristi Noem to Stephen Miller to J.D. Vance to the president himself, as domestic terrorists, in a semantic chain that equates left and liberal resistance to immigration enforcement in our cities, but perhaps especially from white women who are symbolically defended in the fantasy of the white nationalist state. And this imagination equates this nonviolent resistance with feminist and feminine insubordination, and thus a threat to the nation. These leaders demand of us to believe their fantasies over and against the evidence of our own eyes in order to preserve the vision of the nation that they offer us. Lucky for us, the people of Minneapolis, as the people of Chicago, and the people of Portland, and the people of Los Angeles, offer another vision of freedom, another interpretation of our common inheritance. The Declaration of Independence is an imperfect document whose ideals have inspired women to claim their place amongst free citizens and calls us to determine the meaning of freedom in our own age. This is as dangerous a proposition as it was for the men who signed the Declaration, who knew full well the consequences of their rebellion to the British Empire. Nothing about that claim was guaranteed. Its claim was proved through the War of Independence. And nothing about the claim that we inherit from the Declaration is guaranteed. It will be proved through those acts which bind us to it, which call us to renew its promise beyond its exclusions in our own age. It is on us to prove out that struggle again for our own future, to redefine what freedom means to us, to our neighbors, to our nation, and to each other in this moment. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. O, for chairing this panel, and thank you to Professor Michael Genovese for inviting me to speak and for organizing this series, and thank you, Dean Richard Fox, also for supporting these events, and thank you all for coming. We're here to talk about women and the Declaration of Independence, and this has given me an opportunity to reflect on women and the revolutionary period more broadly, and how the ideals of the Declaration animated women's rights movements in the years that followed. It has also allowed me to think about the relationship between the ideals of a founding document and lived experience, as well as historical memory of the revolution, which still, to this day, prioritizes particular versions of the era over others. As a historical document, what does the Declaration actually reflect? Well, historians have written a lot about, in its moment, how it has been described in 1776, how it was many ways, the purpose it served was a call to arms. It was a philosophical document, but it was also a persuasive one, right? Documented to get more on board with the cause of revolution, to inspire others to join the cause of independence. But what other documents and artifacts from the period can tell us about women's lives? A household inventory, a fork, a quilt, for an enslaved woman, a bill of sale. To see women, we, I think, need to analyze the Declaration of Independence, what it meant for its time, but we also need to look further. Going into any surviving bookstore today, I think there's a few, and doing a search on Amazon, you will find founding fathers, not founding mothers. The image of the revolution is still a masculine one, a paternal one, of the writers and signers of the Declaration and the leadership in the early days of the Republic. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams are certainly all significant figures, but there is so much more to know. In this way, we need to think about, but also beyond the Declaration, to the larger context of the time. In the 1980s, historians of women, led by Linda Kerber and Mary Beth Norton, helped us understand the experiences of women in the Revolutionary era. They focused mostly on white women and many women who were literate and of privilege. They also tried to understand the very private history of this time as well. While white women may have not gained legal power or political rights in the Age Revolution, it was a watershed in different ways. As Linda Kerber told us, it forged new meanings of womanhood in the form of Republican mothers who were now gaining more education and charged and were encouraged in some ways to be more educated because they were charged with teaching their children to be good little patriots. And the social tumult of the revolution changed women's personal, familial, and intimate lives and gave women new value and aspirations for education. These historians have helped us understand that this history isn't just about who wrote the Declaration, but about groups of individuals and an era that led to a slow rethinking of the household, the family, the role of education, and what we mean actually by politics. We also know we can't universalize about women's experiences because there were multiple meanings of womanhood then as there are now. For enslaved people in this era, considered property, the road to emancipation would be long and the struggle for equality unfinished. Despite a vast historical literature on the diversity and a diverse history of women from this time, public interest remains glued to singular masculine stories, to individuals, heroic individuals as they're portrayed. As historian Jane Kamensky recently wrote in The Atlantic, quote, "The core premise of women's history has long been that we reorient the inquiry. We not only introduce new characters, but change the story itself, upending ideas about what lies at the margins and what at the center. One mustn't, as the saying goes, simply add women and stir. Half the human race aren't mere chips in the batter. Their inclusion calls for the whole cake," unquote. One woman who has often been added to the recipe and stirred was, of course, married to a founder. In March of 1776, Abigail Adams famously exchanged letters with her husband, John Adams, while he was in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress. She had a lot to be concerned about as she managed the household during his absence. The American Revolution was now an armed conflict with British forces just miles away in Boston, and there were growing fears of the spread of smallpox. Abigail wanted more news from her husband, especially pertaining to what vision was forming for a new government, a new nation. And she wanted to know about the new, quote, code of laws that were being developed. She wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency," unquote. In what are now celebrated and even maybe legendary lines of ink, she urged him to, quote, "remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could," unquote. Abigail was reminding her husband that his political objective was to reject tyranny of a king, so she urged him to avoid hypocrisy and don't let men continue to be tyrants as well and rule women. Now, in response, famously, again, John Adams wrote back to her, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh, adding, quote, depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems, Adams quipped. They would not be subjected to the, quote, despotism of the petticoat, unquote. Now, this exchange has been quoted repeatedly, often becoming a shorthand for the hopes and disappointments of white women in the Revolutionary era, for women like Abigail Adams, who is literate and of privilege. But now John and Abigail Adams often sparred in their letters, which are full of wit and humor, as well as serious exchanges about political questions of the time. But he is truly dismissive, and his sarcastic retort is often depicted as the end of the story. But upon rereading their correspondence again recently, I'm reminded that Abigail's letter is much bolder and complex than the few extracted quotes will tell you. It is not just that she wants to simply be remembered, right? Don't forget me. That's not simply what she's saying, which the abstraction of the quote, I think, makes it seem. She wants a serious rethinking of gender and power, right? She wants the whole cake. In the late 1700s, a married woman's legal status was defined by coverture, or femme covert. So following English common law, a married woman did not exist legally apart from her husband. She could not own property, she could not sign legal contracts, she could not keep her own wages, or do much against the wishes of her husbands. It is also a time in which women were not considered to have the intellectual capacity for politics. Abigail Adams' letter demonstrates more than her capacity for politics. It definitely does that. It also conveys a serious plea for a new model of marriage, one that invokes and co-opts the discourse of her husband's cause. If colonists have endured tyranny from the king, so have women in their households. She even threatens rebellion. And he laughs. When the Declaration of Independence is adopted by the Continental Congress that July, white women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved people were not among those who Thomas Jefferson believed were, quote, created equal. And yet the discourse of liberty proved aspirational, as Dr. Kramer also talked about. A philosophical document, not a legal one, the Declaration articulated a rupture from the past, and for many it was an intellectual resource for a discourse of individual liberty. And those who would be disempowered by laws and customs of the new nation found inspiration in the document. This was true, of course, for many abolitionists who were working to end slavery, as well as Black petitioners and writers who called for freedom in the early republic. This was also true for the call for women's rights in the mid-19th century also an important document known as the Declaration of Sentiments, written largely by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and signed at the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York. The Declaration of Sentiments directly mirrored the structure and phrasing of the Declaration of Independence, and it called for natural rights of women being the same as men. It read, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." It proceeded to outline grievances not towards the king, but towards all men who had, quote, an absolute tyranny over women, who prohibited women from the franchise, who made her, if married, civilly dead. That's a quote from the Declaration, civilly dead. Among its other grievances, the Declaration of Sentiments complained that men controlled employment. Women could not attend college. Women could not retain property brought into marriages. Wives had to obey their husbands. Moreover, as it read, man was, quote, endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. So the Declaration of Sentiments is very concrete about particular grievances in a lot of ways, but it also gets to the point of how women in that world are then, how they operate, right, and their own expectations. So this was a second declaration in some ways, right? There are others, as we've already talked about. It was important in some ways, you know, second, third draft, and indeed in many ways radical for its time. But it's also important to note, like the original declaration, the Declaration of Sentiments also is full of many limitations. The second declaration was written mostly by middle-class Northern white women, white men. Of course, Frederick Douglass was there for the vote on and the signing at Seneca Falls, but at the same time, it was mostly in the interest of reformers, right, who were part of a larger kind of rethinking of society at the time, aiming to kind of change it in their own image. So written mostly by middle-class Northern whites, it ignored the horror of enslavement and ignored indigenous people. It privileged educated white women over non-educated men, and the women's rights movement and its subsequent split would break former alliances with abolitionists. It was exclusionary, and we must remember, of course, what Sojourner Truth asked, right? Ain't I a woman? As she thought about where women's status and the intersection of race and sex at the time. So my job as a historian is to complicate the past, and when it comes to the revolution, it's often something that is not complicated, and in fact, it seems to thrive on simplification. And in this year, the 250th anniversary, we not only face simplification, but erasure. And not just meaning or symbolic erasure, I'm talking literally removing people, erasing people and their stories from American histories, from museums, from plaques, from stories that are being told, from research that's being funded. So with that, I think we need to do much more than just remember the ladies. I think we need to think beyond how we're going to act in this really historical moment. Thank you.
Hi, I feel like I have 3 very tough acts to follow. Oh, thank you. I have 3 very tough acts to follow, and I probably will not be as delightful and as informative, so lower the bar. But I wanted to give a little context. Professor O asked if I'd speak about women's rights as human rights, and I will talk about that briefly. I will talk a little bit about kind of the beginning of, I think, the big shifts in social movements towards women's rights, and then I'll move into women's rights as human rights. And I also wanted to start off from something that Professor O had mentioned. She, and I will not be able to directly quote this, but she did note that we need to be careful when we think about rights because they are still subject to being changed by political ideologies and other forces that can essentially rewind progress that we've made. And so I want to give you a broader story that says really 2 things. One, women's rights have been fully embedded into the human rights regime, and they have been broadly accepted by states of various levels of economic development, political institutions, ideologies, cultural and religious traditions. And yet, the other part of the story that I kind of want to walk you to and lead you through is that even though today, in many places, gender equality norms, embrace for women's equality is relatively strong, and that these norms have developed and they continue to mature, much of the progress that we actually saw, at least in terms of early advances in women's rights, had very little to do with acceptance of gender equality norms. They were largely fueled by specific state interests in advancing particular purposes. And so I think one thing we have to think about today is that these rights that we think of as kind of constitutive of who we are, and we think of as having some kind of permanency, they are subject to hijack and they are subject to change. And unfortunately, I think for women, we live in a time where Dobbs is the beginning, not the end of change, particularly in the US. All right, so when we think about early advances in women's rights, and if we think about this in the American context, these tended to be more piecemeal. And as I mentioned, these were really in many ways and in many cases not intended at fostering gender equality. They were really targeting solving particular societal problems that the state wanted to address. And if we think about the trajectory of women's rights in the US, but this is broadly the process in other countries as well, women initially got some social and some economic rights, followed by political rights, followed by civil rights, and then to some extent, full economic and full social rights, albeit these rights are of course mediated, or people's access to these rights are mediated by class, by age, by gender, by racial or ethnic or other forms of identity. And I also wanted to kind of follow up on an institution that Professor Bittel raised. So much of the kind of initial advocacy around women's rights and the changes that we saw were fundamentally at eroding the institution of coverture. Professor Bittel mentioned that this is a tradition of British common law, but various forms of coverture existed across other European landscapes. So the French had their own form that was embedded and kind of originated with Napoleonic law. The Spanish had their own traditions. We also saw traditions in Roman law. And to the extent that we saw these institutions in continental Europe and the United Kingdom, we also saw these institutions in the places that they colonized. So these institutions were very widespread. The erosion of coverture in no way was a single act. It was a variety of new laws that chipped away at various forms of coverture. And let me go back and remind you what coverture really meant in practice. It meant at marriage that women no longer had an independent legal identity. Their legal identity was subsumed within their husbands. So Professor Bittel mentioned this with respect to property and other economic rights, but it extended beyond this. But when we think about these early advances that were piecemeal, at least in the United States, the first significant erosions of coverture came with extensions of property rights, which in theory should have meant that women had stronger economic rights. But in practice, and in many states in the US, extensions of property rights to women were fundamentally about protecting family property and protecting the financial assets of families. That is to say that states in many places extended women property rights because they wanted to protect assets of families in times of economic downturns. If women held independent rights and a husband declared bankruptcy, then a woman's assets would be separate from what a creditor could repossess. And so in large part, these were extensions that were really aimed at resolving problems of poverty and the dependence of Americans on social welfare provided by the state. A second major change, and in the same kind of line, in 1957, we saw one of the first international conventions on women's rights, which was the Convention on the Nationality of Married Women. The Convention on the Nationality of Married Women did one very impressive thing. It said that women had a legal right to an independent nationality that neither marriage nor the dissolution of marriage could change. And this might seem like a great achievement for women, but this too was a response to a societal problem that had arisen between World War I and World War II. Many men became declared enemy aliens. They were stripped of their citizenship, and so we had a rise in the number of stateless people. With the rise in the number of stateless people, we had a growing number of people on the poverty rolls. States were required to, or there was a necessity to take care of people. And so much like with property rights, the Convention on the Nationality of Married Women was proposed to address problems of statelessness, but also to reduce dependence on the state. I will give you one more example of this that's more current, and then I'm going to go back and say perhaps the one standalone success that truly was about gender equality. So my third example is that to some extent we take reproductive rights for granted today. But when we think about perhaps one of the most important reproductive rights, which is access to family planning, which in practice means the right to determine whether you have children, the right to determine how many children you have, the right to determine when you actually have them, so to space them. This fundamental right was not about gender equality. Family planning rights largely expanded in the between the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. And reproductive rights, by and large, they diffused across countries on the coattails of two things. Eugenics movements, so movements to limit certain people from having children, and development economics, a concern that the world would become overpopulated, that we couldn't feed the world's population, and that this would drive countries to poverty. And so these two forces came together and they created strong political headwinds that allowed for the diffusion of family planning into countries and international contexts where it probably would have had no foothold. All right, so these are all examples of expansions in women's rights that had very little to do with an embrace of women's equality. I said there was one shining example, and that shining example is the Convention on Political Rights. That was not one of the first, but in fact the first international convention passed in 1951. Okay. Between these first two conventions on political rights and then the nationality rights of women, there was momentum in the international community to develop women's rights as human rights. But before I get to that, I want to speak a little bit about kind of the origin of human rights and tie this a little bit back to the Declaration. And I apologize because I see students from my current human rights course here, so you've heard parts of this. But following the atrocities of World War II, there was strong support among countries in what we'd call today the global north, but also the global south, for embracing this new idea called human rights. And despite American political elites' kind of wavering commitment to internationalism, in the years that followed World War II, it's perhaps strangely accurate to say that we wouldn't have human rights if it were not for the United States. There was deep support for establishing human rights in international institutions, and that was primarily fueled by American political elite, but not simply American political elite. And I think that a lot of this has to do with the fact that we have a culture of rights. We have a deeply embedded, long-standing tradition of rights that we hold dear, and that in the aftermath of World War II, there was a strong impetus, a strong moral impetus, not only from political leaders, but also from the American public, that these rights and the ideas about ethics and morality should diffuse more globally. Where did this support come from in American society? It was broad-based. It came from American legal societies. It came from intellectuals. It came from news media, which at the time would have been largely print media. And it had strong popular backing. When other global powers wanted to reverse course and retrench from commitments to human rights, American political leaders had barriers to doing so. Americans wanted human rights. Okay, so how do women's rights come about? So in the international human rights regime, there is a convention. It is called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It was passed in 1979. It is the fourth of 9 major treaties that constitute the international human rights regime. And unlike these previous attempts that were relatively piecemeal, meaning they picked up an issue here or an issue there, CEDAW was a comprehensive document. It dealt with everything from family and marriage and reproductive rights to ensuring women political equality and, at least in theory, equal pay. In many ways, CEDAW was and is a remarkable treaty, and in a comparative sense, when we think about it next to other human rights treaties, it was proposed, or I should say it was drafted and affirmed in 1979, and it entered into force 2 short years later. That is a very quick turnaround. When you think about it in the context of things like the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, that took years. Years, not short 2, closer to decades. All right, so CEDAW is passed and women's rights come onto the scene, but really the big significant movements in women's rights really transpired towards the end of the Cold War. By the late 1980s, early 1990s, we have political slogans, one that I'm assuming several of you are familiar with: women's rights are human rights. And at the end of the Cold War, we see really 2 big changes besides this slogan, which I think actually embody this slogan. Amnesty International, one of the 2 largest human rights organizations, decides to pick up women's rights as an issue. So one thing you may not be familiar with is Amnesty International used to be a really niche human rights organization. It had one issue. It only advocated for freedom of conscience. And it really was a political tool in the Cold War that was largely directed, the spear was largely pointing at the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact states. By the end of the Cold War, Amnesty realizes it needs to expand, and it broadens its agenda. And women's equality makes the top of their list. A second major change that happens in the late 80s, early 90s is we have the 4th Conference on Women, otherwise called the Beijing Conference, and it really popularizes and consolidates the slogan, women's rights are human rights. This is largely attributed to Hillary Clinton, but I believe the origin of women's rights are human rights actually originates with NGOs in the Philippines. But by 1995, it is deeply connected to women globally, and Hillary Clinton is largely seen as the person who kind of consolidated its position in the movement. When we think about human rights globally, we have seen a number of advances in women's rights, and despite these very significant advances, and let me underline, these advances are real, we still see problems. And advocacy continues. There are continued challenges to circumscriptions of women's rights. So this picture that you've endured for a very long time, I think is perhaps one of the better known cases of late. These pictures are from Iranian protests that emerged in 2022 in response to the killing of an Iranian Kurdish woman for her non-compliance with mandatory veiling. And that movement is called Women Life Freedom, very appropriate for this panel, but it inspired a number of Iranian women to engage in civil disobedience. The woman on your right, who is not wearing her scarf, that is 2 years after the initial protests. And even through this latest bout of protests in Iran, you can continue to see women who flagrantly disregard the hijab ruling in Iran. And they face a number of consequences for this. But we also have lesser known cases, cases that are less visible, but no less important. So on your right, you also have a movement in India that emerged about a decade ago called #IWillGoOut. Public spaces are often quite dangerous for women in India. And this is really a take back the street. As part of this broader movement of Take Back the Street, we have organizations in India that are also working on women working in occupations that they traditionally would not work in. So women working in transportation services, meaning driving taxis, driving buses, working delivery, services that expose women to bodily harm, which are typically seen as not women's work. But all of this is to say that despite the fact that we have seen advances in these rights, problems remain. And I promise to wrap this up here very quickly, but maybe I'll put you back at Carla's beautiful slide because I thought it was great. Nope, I'm moving one more. I'm going. Okay. Sorry. that, these gaps between the rights as promised and how states behave are something that we should expect. This is par for the course. This is something that we expect to take a long time. We expect there to be mobilization for rights and counter-mobilization against people seeking redistribution. That is all within the regular wheelhouse. But I do want to alert you to, and kind of come back full circle to this idea that I kind of left, or I started with at the beginning, that I think that we get this sense that rights are permanent, and we maybe get a little complacent. And I mentioned that since many of these rights actually came to us, not so much for an embrace of the actual norm that underlies them, but because of political interests, that we also have to be very wary that that is on the horizon. And one of the things that I do want to conclude by saying is the reproductive rights that expanded in the 60s and the 70s that allowed women to have full lives, to have careers, to choose the size of their family, those rights are under attack in pretty much every country. Here is the sad rub. Family planning was very, very successful. The goal of development economists in the 60s and the 70s was to change women's preferences, to change the preferences of couples, and that happened. People want smaller families. That's true everywhere. People have fewer kids, marriages are delayed, and this was initially heralded as a success until today, most developed countries, most countries in the global north, and many countries in the global south cannot replace their populations. Fertility levels have fallen below what are called replacement levels. And in response, many states have begun to embrace what's called pronatalism, encouraging birth. Whether this is by paying women or paying families, whether it is by giving you tax credits for having more children, states are employing a variety of financial incentives, but they're also changing their discourse. They're also limiting access to contraceptives. We should start to see rollbacks in reproductive freedom, rollbacks in bodily autonomy. The state has a very strong interest in increasing fertility. And I think that is on the table for us today.
Thank you so much to our panelists and for their wonderful and insightful remarks. Hopefully it gave you a lot to think about. It gave me a lot to think about. So I'm just gonna go through the index cards for questions, and thank you for this. This is a very good question. What do you think women's rights will look like in 20 years?
Okay. Do I need to move back to the mic or I'm okay?
No, you're okay. There's also mics here. Oh, yeah, one of these. Yeah, there we go.
So what do we think they'll look like? Such a broad question, so difficult to answer. I think in terms of reproductive rights, which is kind of what I closed on, I think that many states are going to be developing new narratives about what are the ideal roles of women, what are the ideal conceptions of family, and these rhetoric or discourses may take a while to develop, but ultimately socialization is a slow rolling process. I expect that we're going to see some changes because the state has such a vested interest in economic growth and development. So at least on this issue, I think states are going to become more successful. And maybe we won't quite feel it because we'll become re-socialized. And our conceptions of what's good might change. In terms of other rights, it's difficult because we're not quite specific, but I think we'll, of course, still see these kind of gaps between laws and norms that states have committed themselves to and what they actually practice. But I will also underscore something that I said to somebody earlier today, which is that I think we tend to think about and worry about deviations from kind of Enlightenment Western values with respect to women's rights. But cultural practices are much broader, much more ubiquitous than whether you conform to how we understand equality in America. And so I think we're going to continue to see a variety of practices across states. And some of these hurdles will look like nonconformity to Western ideals. But I think there are a number of cultural barriers that we don't even recognize being cultural barriers that are perhaps in some ways more nefarious because we don't recognize them as problems. And they will continue to impede full realization, which kind of tying this back into the language of the Declaration means limited liberty, limited freedom.
I guess I'll just say historians are really not good at predictions. Although we like to think about the present and the future a lot. So that was really helpful. I'm not sure what I might have to add. I think thinking, as we know, a lot can change in 12 months. So a lot can change. So thinking ahead to 20 years is a little daunting. But I do think, just to connect to something Feryal said, thinking about the history of reproductive rights, I really appreciated that you brought in the history of eugenics, because historians of eugenics have, talked a lot about how family planning and, became very useful to some. It wasn't about women's right to control their own body, right? It was about controlling who was reproducing. So I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought up. But we are in a pronatalist era, right? This is certainly, I think, especially coming from some of the highest positions like the vice presidency. So this is how long that will last or what will happen. I think I'm uncomfortable predicting, but it's a great question to ponder.
I think that what I would say is that it's contestable, right? Like nothing is guaranteed, nothing's set in stone. I think it is radically contestable. It's being contested right at this very moment. For instance, like the fertility rates of global north countries are a cause of one of the major causes of the demand for migrant labor. And so like the what's going on in the streets of Minneapolis is itself a reflection of this very point that you're making. But there is another story that's happening there as well. There's a rejection of the of the state, at least this state's push to define citizenship in such narrow terms. I don't know what that will look like, but I wanted to gesture towards that alternative in my remarks, focusing on the city and the value of the neighbor. Not nothing.
It's really interesting that the Declaration of Independence was a document against citing the grievances against tyranny, right? And several of the panelists spoke about how the counter documents speaking to the Declaration of Independence, whether that might be the Declaration of Sentiments or the Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, or Remember the Ladies, was against also a different type of tyranny. And so within that framework, I guess this is the question from an audience member. Can you expand on the non-violence resistance equated to femininity that would make it a threat?
Thank you. Thanks for opening that door for me. Yes, I think that one of the ways that we can understand what's happening in not just Minneapolis, but in the sort of like uh, resistance to the president's secret immigration police that has been learned and passed from city to city from June here in Los Angeles on, is that it takes a lot of work, and there are a lot of different kinds of work that are going on. One of the biggest forms of this work is associated with feminized modes of labor, right? It's happening in churches, it's happening in amongst like group chats of like women who like share pickup and drop off duties at schools. They are now organizing patrols to ensure that kids can get back and forth to and from school safely. They're organizing grocery pickup and drop offs. They're organizing diaper drives. A lot of this like feminized labor is absolutely crucial to these kinds of civic resistance, these nonviolent modes of resistance that are going on. So long as that remains a little bit like undercover or not so visible, I think that it doesn't really pose so much of a threat. But when those women take positions in the street blowing whistles, um, they can sometimes be seen. I mean, it seems like they have attracted a particular form of ire from state agents because they're acting out of their place. Even that nonviolent action, right? Recording, following, blowing whistles, warning neighbors, even like yelling at state agents is nonviolent. That's not that's being equated with domestic terrorism in some areas of our current federal government, but it's essentially nonviolent. So I think that there is something at play there, not just with femininity, but white femininity, precisely because the defense of the the defense of the nation that the immigration policing is supposed to be producing is often described as a defense of white womanhood, and that is something that on the ground activists are working against.
We have another question from the audience, and I'm just going to frame the question a little bit. Given Professor Charif's comments earlier that the idea of human rights came after World War II and was really supported by the United States, perhaps given the moniker of like leader of the free world, right, after World War II. Given that history, does the United States stands on supporting human rights at the global level, right? Is that connected to its history of the culture of rights, particularly the Declaration of Independence? Number one, this is the first part of the question. And secondly, if we were to kind of consider a revision of the Declaration today, how would it be different?
I'll tackle part one of that question. I'll leave two for all. I think it's definitely connected. I think it's connected in the following way. It wasn't particularly surprising at the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration that legal societies from a variety of countries would have a vested interest in this idea of human rights. And it perhaps wasn't even that surprising that intellectuals would. But one of the most important reasons that the US, despite changed political conditions between 1945 and 1948, and namely here the Cold War, the reason that we couldn't walk back our commitment to human rights is because the American street wanted it. And to kind of borrow some of Professor Bittel's words, we talk about the revolution in very simple, uncomplicated terms. And I think the way that we think about rights in this country is that we all have them, even though when we press people, nobody would say that's true. But we do have a very distinctive culture of rights and the way that we think about rights and the values that we hold intensely. And those really manifest into the political space between 1945 and 1948. So I think that our particular lived history influenced that particular chapter in global history. But it has, of course, as we all know, not extended to an intense support for human rights in all places and in all times since that point. In terms of a revision of the Declaration, I might wait to hear my panelists weigh in.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed hearing Feryal talk about the more recent history of human rights. I'd want to, I mean, my understanding is that there is also human rights are invoked in the abolitionist era too, especially the British abolitionists. So it's kind of an interesting like concept over time to kind of think about, especially in the Cold War era, the invocation of human rights and for what purpose. I mean, I think it's such an interesting and hard question to think about how we would revise it, because I think if we think about it as a historical document, right, it was a political document that had this like purpose, right? I mean, the idea was to have a vote to get a Continental Congress on board, right, and another way to kind of have a purpose for declaring a separation, right? Declaring an independence. Again, a lot of historians talk about it in this way that it was very useful at the time, right? Rather than it's not a law, right? It's a philosophical kind of statement that had a real political purpose, right? That has subsequently, right then and subsequently had a lot of meaning, right? That people derived a lot of meaning from it. So I think the idea of writing, what would it look like today or rethinking it, I think one thing to think about is it's always kind of been rethought, right? It's always been adapted and invoked and, you know, co-opted and reinterpreted in different ways, and I think that process continues, right? It's especially in our own time when we have this 250th anniversary coming this summer, we're going to see a particular version of what it means, right? We need to really consciously be aware that we're being told this is what it means, right? And we can see it differently, right?
Yeah, I don't think I have much more to add than that. It's we want 1, 2, 4, 8, many declarations, right? Like nothing. I love the Dr. Bittel, your discussion of the declaration as a particular document for a particular purpose. It's helpful to remember that it did have a particular political purpose, though it then inspired many more such documents. I think that that's a good lesson to take from the declaration itself, and I await its next iteration.
I want to clarify one thing. I am in no way arguing for original intent, but I am saying contextualizing it, right? And then looking at how different iterations over time, putting them in context. Just making sure.
I also think to kind of maybe weave together a few of these comments, what we understand as moral and ethically right today, or liberal and inclusive, is maybe true for this moment, but it will change over time. And so the Declaration was written in a movement. I'm sorry, the Declaration was written at a moment to serve a specific set of goals. So I don't think we'd revise it, but our understandings of what rights people should have, the protections they should have, the access they should have, those have all evolved. And they're going to continue to evolve. And I think that's really what the question is getting at. So this is really kind of regular progression. Or we could have 1, 2, 4, and 8.
I just want to connect that to what Professor Kramer mentioned in her talk about the 10-point program, right? How they actually kind of evoked the preamble or re-articulate the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, but at the same time advocated for things like access to healthcare, affordable housing, right? And so I think these might be the various ways that the Declaration itself isn't revised, but the spirit of the Declaration is constantly being kind of reenacted upon. So Professor Charif mentioned the fourth conference on women, the Beijing conference in 1995, where the idea of women's rights as human rights kind of solidified, and spoke about Hillary Clinton kind of bringing that to force. The question here from the audience is, do you think current prominent figures like Christine Nome and Pam Bondi have changed or will change how women view leadership in politics?
I think that there's almost certainly a literature that talks about whose messages we listen to and whose messages we uptake. So I think if you subscribe to political ideologies and narratives that are more in line with a Christy Nome and a Pam Bondi, and those who have the long tresses, then I think that they are relevant peers for you, right? Or they influence your thought. And if you find if you reject those ideas or you find somebody else more palatable, you're more likely to listen to them. So I guess in large part what I'm telling you is we should expect people to be influenced by the people who have values that are similar to them or who they want to emulate or who they otherwise look up to. But if those figures are polarizing or distasteful to you, you're very unlikely to change your behavior. But I will open it to others.
I mean, yes. Like, how could it be otherwise? Like, it certainly does change the aesthetics of what a leader looks like. But I think that Dr. Sharif is right on. Those aesthetics are really like framed by, at least right now, a particular political ideology. For some people, like Ilhan Omar is what a leader looks like, or Jasmine Crockett. You know, there are a lot of available examples that are framed by political ideology. I think that the aesthetics are that also tells a particular story about what modes of femininity are more legible or more acceptable in leadership. But I mean, the answer can only be yes.
Fantastic. That'll conclude presence and your questions. I also want to thank our wonderful panelists and to just continue to engage and deepen our discussions in our democratic commitment to the values that were espoused initially by the Declaration, even though I know this panel, we talked a lot about the lived exclusions, right? That we also must recognize when discussing the Declaration of Independence. So I do urge everyone to attend the other events that are part of this series as well. And once again, thanks for coming to this panel today.